Welcome to the Story Lab. Today, we are diving into the Star Trek universe. Specifically, into that universe's early history. In Star Trek, we have heard many a time that during the late 20th and mid-21st century there were great wars going on Earth, yet when we visited these times, we never saw those conflicts and/or got conflicting information about it. It is time to come up with a definitive timeline of the history of Earth before United Earth, putting all the bits and pieces together. So that is what we are going to experiment with today, a Star Trek prehistory, explaining the Eugenics Wars, the Third World War, and how it all fits together. Here is what we are going to do, and what not. We are going to come up with a consistent backstory for the universe that could be used for future stories. Give an indication of where this timeline deviates from the real universe, so that time travel into the real current time can be treated in the right context. Give an overall view of the events and an approximate timeline. What we are not doing is describing specific events or giving exact dates. Fix every plot hole in the entire universe. Claim this to be the only option for the story. Okay, let's peek into the Star Trek series and put together what we know about the late 20th and early 21st century in the Star Trek universe. Augments are present on Earth during the late 20th century and they take over massive countries. Most augments, though not Khan Noonien Singh, are aggressive tyrants. There is a lot of infighting between different augment groups. There is a devastating, but maybe relatively short, war that is fought against the augments, ending in 1996, with the defeat of Khan. Around the same time there is a computer revolution, though how that came about is unknown by the 24th century. The ISS and the Millennium Gate were built around the turn of the millennium. In the early 21st century, there were problems throughout Europe, concerning among others so-called neo-Trotskyists. In the USA, a significant population was locked into camps until the Bell riots informed everyone of the state of living in these camps and the people were reintegrated into society. Continued fighting about personal freedoms and eugenics lead to a period known as the Second American Civil War and eventually the start of World War III. The period is so unstable that later historians would sometimes not even distinguish between the three conflicts. World War III starts officially in 2026. During the war, self-appointed Colonel Green is active in the Americas, leading a charge to purify the population. At least the initial battles of the war are fought with nuclear weapons. One faction is known as the Eastern Coalition. Nevertheless, space exploration continues at least during the 2030s, with the first extrasolar system mission as well as the early Mars missions taking place during that time. Also, several biomes are sent away from Earth to be preserved in space. These would later be a part of Starbase 1. The war lasts for decades, during which much information is lost, but higher education at least in some form is still possible, as Zephram Cochrane goes to university during that time. World War III ends by the 2050s, though not much of Earth's original government is left. A period of post-atomic horror starts, which, depending on the region, would last until the 2080s. In 2063 first contact is made between humans and Vulcans, and a time of rebuilding begins. Okay, and in addition to that we might have to consider a few other bits of information. Technological development is different in this timeline. Especially, starships with cryostasis technology are present by 1996, a live-streamed internet is present by the 2020s, and a cure for cancer is known by the start of the Third World War. Augments seem to tend to be of Asian descent. Chekhov refers to Russian city names by Soviet time names, indicating that the history of the Soviet Union has gone differently. Voyagers 4 through 6 were started in the late 20th century, while in reality there only were 2 Voyager probes. Later, in 2004, Nomad was launched. Up to the 1960s, there was no indication of any differences between the real timeline and the Star Trek timeline. Okay, let's summarize these points a bit for our list of ingredients. Augments in the East, taking over and being defeated in the 1990s in the Eugenics Wars. The fighting about eugenics continues to the start of the Third World War in the mid-21st century. Several technological breakthroughs are made. During the Third World War, there is still space travel. The post-atomic horror continues beyond first contact, at least in some regions of the planet. Put it all in and let it be analyzed. We're ready. Here come the results. We begin the story during the time of the so-called space race. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, was chartered by the United States of America in 1958, eventually becoming Earth's premier spacefaring organization until the founding of the United Earth Space Probe Agency, CA 2067. However, during its beginnings the NASA stood in a hard competition to the already successful USSR space program. This initiated the human space race, wherein the two powers tried to outdo one another by first reaching major milestones of space travel. Along with the launch of the Ranger program and Apollo spacecraft, humanity made the first steps on another world when Neil Armstrong walked on Earth's moon Luna at the end of the 1960s decade. Soon after, the space race was considered over, with the USSR focusing on other projects and major milestones no longer achieved by them. This had two reasons. Firstly, the crash and salvaging of a UFO in the USSR regions triggered an advancement in technology, with the development of the first isograted circuit. However, this only became known much later. Secondly, and more importantly, the USSR focused more on human genome manipulation and eugenics. The point of distinction between the Star Trek and the real timeline might boil down to a single decision, for example a secret meeting between USSR decision makers, where they debated whether they should support the space program or the eugenics program. In the Star Trek timeline, they decided for the eugenics program, and so research started into making better humans, supermen, popularly known as the augments, who were mentally and physically superior to ordinary humans. While records from this period are fragmented, it is clear that the first group of true augments was conceived in the late 1950s all throughout the regions that at the time were known as the Second World. With their intelligence being double that of normal humans, the augments were capable of driving the economic and technological developments of the Asian regions. This manifested itself fully when the first generation of augmented people reached adulthood around the 1970s and 80s, showcasing their heightened intellect by developing new technologies, such as cryo-freezing systems, rapidly. This also strengthened the Asian continent and the USSR in general, which were struggling economically more than the Western world. Their creators had hoped that the augments would lead humanity into an era of peace in a world that had only known war. However, one aspect these scientists had overlooked was the personality of the augments. Along with their superior abilities, the augments were aggressive and arrogant, flaws which the scientists were unable to correct at the time due to the infancy of the science. One of the augments' creators realized the error, writing that superior ability breeds superior ambition. That same scientist was ultimately killed by one of his own creations. Within a short time span, the augments became invaluable to the nations where they lived, and they quickly became part of the local government bodies and other vital political, economic and infrastructure organizations. All of this happened in a frighteningly short time span. By the end of the 1980s, augments were in control of nearly the entire Asian continent. Finally, the period known as the Cold War ended rather abruptly, when the Soviet Union was forcefully dissolved by the augments, who divided the territories up between themselves, executing the Soviet leadership. Now, the augments became tyrannic dictators, who not only ruled over their citizens with an iron fist, but also fought among each other constantly. In addition, they were all expansionistic and quickly took over even more neighboring countries. The regions they controlled included Russia, China, the Indian subcontinent, and Indonesia. Khan Noonien Singh, the most powerful of the augment leaders, controlled nearly a fourth of the planet's population at one point. He was still considered a relatively benign dictator though. The augments and their forces were progressing extremely fast, taking over most of the Eastern Hemisphere within a few years. Soon, the Western world saw no other way but to intervene and start fighting against the augment nations. This war became known as the Eugenics Wars, a very destructive conflict fought primarily in the eastern part of the world and northern Africa. The war would eventually cost the lives of 30 million people and leave the Asian continent in disarray. With the takeover by the Augments and the onset of the war, scientists from the Second World fled to their former enemy the USA. With them, they brought some of the technological developments of the Augments, such as methods of bacteriological warfare, cryotube technology, and new models for spacecraft of all kinds. The USA benefited greatly from these defectors and later from captured Augments as well. It was thanks to these developments that space shuttles could be launched regularly even during the Eugenics Wars, that for additional Voyager probes could be built and prototypes for the later DY-class transports could constructed and tested, all within a few years. Naturally, these developments led to major discussions within the Western world as to the use of that knowledge and genetic manipulation in general. Occurring during a time of fighting for personal freedoms in general in the USA, these discussions led to some major outbreaks of violence, which would later be characterized by historians as a Second American Civil War, though that term has to be applied loosely, as it was nothing compared to the actual war overseas, where millions of people died. After years of fighting, the Eugenics Wars came to an end in 1996 with the defeat of various Augment leaders. Khan remained as the last dictator. Khan and over 80 of the Supermen were condemned to die as war criminals by the victorious Western powers. However, Khan had anticipated that and arranged for his escape. Khan and 84 of his followers managed to flee the planet aboard the newly constructed early sleeper ship, the SS Botany Bay, which was actually supposed to transport prisoners such as them. This ended the war against the quote-unquote Asian Augments. However, the USA still profited greatly from all the new technology they had gained from Augment developments and were keen on using this knowledge, especially for additional space programs such as the construction of the ISS and the design of the Nomad probe. In addition, the Western governments used the Augment technology to build space habitats, including the first space research outposts in the asteroid belt, a series of installations known as the cold stations. While outwardly projecting ideas of unity and rebuilding, internally the governments of Earth were having controversial debates regarding the fate of thousands of still unused Augment embryos. Uncertain of how to handle the issue, the governments finally opted to have the embryos placed into cold storage on one of the cold stations, unbeknownst to the public. In addition, discussions regarding the use of Augment technology and the basics of human genome manipulation continued as the new millennium began. Developing very efficient fission and early fusion reactors thanks to these Augment-developed technologies, NASA constructed and planned multiple new space missions to explore the solar system. The orbital vehicle 160 Linus was developed for near-Earth. Meanwhile, other missions were conducted with the cryotube technology and sleeper ships, which were the first manned missions to the outer solar system. One of these early missions led to Saturn and was commanded by Colonel Sean Jeffrey Christopher. While these missions were important steps in human exploration, they only served to increase discussions around Augment technologies as the next generations became adults. Having not themselves lived through the Eugenics Wars, this Generation Z was divided over the topic of eugenics, which led to further general division. In the 2020s, neo-Trotskyists unseated the Gaullists from power in France amid widespread disruptive student protests that led to the view that Europe was falling apart. In the USA, the government created special sanctuary districts in most major cities to cope with poverty and unemployment, as a means to circumvent problems as they were occurring in Europe. While established with the benevolent intent of providing free housing and food, as well as prospects for future employment, the sanctuaries quickly degenerated into inhumane internment camps. Their poor state was finally made known to the public with the Bell riots, which led to a general effort to avoid social problems such as poverty in the future, even when the Third World War started only a few years later. World War III started when the political and ideological problems reached a boiling point. The first nuclear were being launched from the nuclear powers of Europe in 2026. The American powers fought back with nuclear weapons as well. The eastern parts of Earth united into the ECON, the Eastern Coalition, and also become involved. Thanks to rapid developments in medicine over the first part of 21st century, many of the deadly effects of radiation poisoning could be averted. However, the sheer number of weapons employed would lead to horrible mutations. Most of the more populated areas of Earth, such as the American big cities and the European capitals, were made uninhabitable, with the majority of citizens fleeing to more rural parts of their respective nations. Later in that same year, Colonel Green led a faction of eco-terrorists trough the American continent, further instigating the war. The war would last for decades. However, most engagements after the first nuclear strikes were traditional ground-based battles. This meant that certain parts of the countries were relatively stable throughout different periods of the war. NASA would use these times to push for even more space exploration, not only to further knowledge, but also to give humanity a perspective for the future. Missions during that time were the first manned mission to leave the solar system and the early Mars missions, which for the first time involved landing on the planet and prepped the world for the establishment of the Mars colonies. Also, shortly after the beginning of the war, scientists used augment-developed technology to send small biospheres out to the edge of the solar system, hoping to at least save part of Earth's ecosystem, in case everything else should be destroyed. The Third World War finally ended in 2053, when everyone simply gave up fighting and most of the technologies and ideologies that the fighting had been about had been lost anyways. 10 years later, first contact happened, leading to aggressive efforts to undo the effects of the war. This was approached differently throughout the world. Many regions of the planet reformed governments and then united into a united Earth. Colonel Green still pushed for purification through genocide though. And in some pockets of the planet, the post-atomic horror continued for decades. Now the aggressive space developments of NASA benefited Earth, as they were able to quickly establish mining colonies on the Moon and Mars and expand their race into a spacefaring one, who could join the interstellar community. That is our whole prehistory. What do you think of it? Please note that everything presented here is simply the results of an experiment. No part of this presentation is intended as a correction of an existing story or claims to be the real story. The selection or omission of any parts of the source material is not to be understood as commentary, positive or negative, on the original productions. These are simply thoughts and experiments based on existing material, and none of it could be created without the work of all those involved in creating the original works. As with any scientific result, you may utilize any of the story ideas that resulted from these experiments for your own experiments or production, while citing this experiment as its source. It is now closing time for our lab. Goodbye until next time.